The right to protest. Vietnam War draft. The streets were filled with angry people. They yelled, screamed, and shouted, waving signs that said, "End the war in Vietnam, and we won't go." Police tried to stop the mob, but the people were too furious. Why were these American citizens so angry? They felt that their rights were being taken from them as men were drafted into the Vietnam War, a war that few people agreed with and believed in. They didn't think that the military had the right to draft men that would end up being killed or having to kill innocent Vietnamese people.
While citizens of the United States do have a responsibility to defend and protect their country when they are threatened, the U.S. government should not have had the right to draft young men into a war that so many people were against, especially since the United States hadn't been directly attacked. The Vietnam War had nothing to do with the U.S. to begin with, and should not have become any of their business at all.
So why did the United States get involved in Vietnam? The Vietnamese had been fighting against French colonial rule for decades before America actually became part of the war. Communist revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh had tried to convince the U.S. to help him fight the French for years, but the U.S. refused to help and actually decided to assist France. This was because of anti-communist sentiment in the U.S. This was known as the Cold War. Since the United States didn't want Vietnam to fall to communism, they chose to help the French instead. This was based upon the domino theory, which suggested the idea that if one country fell to communism, all the surrounding countries would fall to communism as well. In 1954, the French pulled out of the Vietnam War and the United States stepped in, still trying to stop Vietnam from becoming communist.
After the United States became involved in the Vietnam War, the government quickly realized that they did not have enough enlisted men to send into battle, so they resorted to conscription.
The first lottery drawing for the Vietnam War was held on December 1st, 1969. It determined the order of which men got called first for induction in the war. The lottery numbers were determined by the birth date of the men. There were 366 capsules with birth dates on them. The first date was December 14th and was drawn by Alexander Perney. All the men with a draft number 195 and below were called for induction. The lottery was broadcasted on radio, TV, and film.
As the war grew bigger, the demand for soldiers went up. The government had to draft more and more men, which meant the regular rules for drafting changed. Up until this time, men who were enrolled in college, married, or had children were typically not drafted. But for the first time in American history, these rules were discarded as the need for troops soared. This angered U.S. citizens. They didn't feel the responsibility to fight in a war that the United States didn't even need to be involved with. The U.S. had not been directly attacked, and Vietnam was halfway around the world. Why should men be drafted into war that they didn't even support? An anti-draft flyer states, "We oppose the draft because the government has no business forcing us into the army, forcing us to go to war, to kill and be killed. Young men should be free to determine their own future, free from coercion. If America's young men thought we were in a just war, there would be no need for conscription. They would go on their own free will."
As more men were drafted, the protest against the draft escalated. Furious Americans resorted to drastic measures to protest. Multiple violent strikes and riots erupted. Many students were opposed to the draft as their education was put on hold to go serve in the Vietnam War. They openly protested the war, saying it was unjust and unfair. Men burnt draft cards, faked mental or physical disabilities, refused to report, and even moved to Canada. People demonstrated against the war, yelling and handing out flyers.
When I was doing my military training, I was at Florida State, where many of the students demonstrated against the war. And whenever we had our Thursday afternoon drills, there were a lot of students that came out and yelled at us and chanted and gave us handouts, and made us feel like we were being traitors for agreeing to be in the military.
Did people have the responsibility to serve their country during this time? There was much debate about this. Some people believed that men should serve in the war and be drafted because they had the responsibility to serve their country and that it was a way to repay the United States for their rights and freedom. They felt that the U.S. government had the right to draft soldiers because it was still a war America was involved with, and despite the fact that the U.S. may not need to be involved with it, men should still serve their country. Others argued that the war was none of America's business anyway, so men should not have to serve. They said that these young men were being taken from their families and homes to fight in a place that few people even knew anything about. They claimed that the rights they had been given as a free citizen were being taken away when America hadn't even been attacked. It wasn't fair for an innocent man to risk his life and suffer from the thought of killing another living, breathing human being. It didn't matter if Vietnam was starting to be communist. It was not going to affect the U.S. for years to come.
The Vietnam War was not the first war in which the U.S. government had enacted a draft. A draft was used in the Civil War, as well as in both World Wars. However, the general feeling was much different in comparison. For example, in 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, which prompted the United States to become involved in World War II, people rushed to enlist in the Army. And even though a draft was used, few opposed it. This was not the case during the Vietnam War. The United States had not been attacked or directly threatened. It was for these reasons that people felt no responsibility or obligation to go to war or to defend their rights.
Well, I think that it changed because before, when my father was in the war, if you were married and had children, you were not drafted. We were married and we had a child and one on the way. But in the Vietnam War, that didn't make any difference.
The Vietnam War and the draft had massive consequences. It is estimated that around 58,000 American soldiers died in the war, and 2,100,000 Vietnamese died due to bombing and other fights. The Vietnam War is considered to be the fourth most deadly war in American history. Approximately 51% of deaths and 16% of wounds were caused by small arms fire. 36% of deaths and 65% of wounds were caused by fragments from artillery. 11% of deaths and 15% of wounds were caused by booby traps and mines. 2% of wounds were caused by punji stakes, and 2% of deaths and 2% of wounds were caused by other means. These statistics show the real tragedy of war, that there is rarely glory or justice to be found, and instead demonstrates how destructive war truly is. The Vietnam War also destroyed American citizens' trust in the government forever, as lies, deaths, and protests caused people to doubt the government greatly. In the end, the U.S. government didn't accomplish their original goals, as Vietnam ended up becoming a communist country anyway.
On December 9, 1814, long before the Vietnam War, Daniel Webster gave a speech to the United States House of Representatives when he argued against the government's right to draft citizens against their will. He said, "Where is it written in the Constitution, in what article or section is it contained, that you may take children from their parents and parents from their children, and compel them to fight the battles of any war in which the folly or the wickedness of government may engage it? Under what concealment has this power lain hidden, which now for the first time comes forth, with a tremendous and baleful aspect, to trample down and destroy the dearest rights of personal liberty?" The Vietnam Draft, along with all of the controversy surrounding the Vietnam War in general, brought Webster's fears to life.
As stated before, the government should not have had the right to draft men, especially to the extent that they did. They got involved with something that they shouldn't have had any part in, but because they did, the need for troops grew. This twisted the draft so that men that had wives, families, and an education were separated. They were taken for months and years to a strange place they barely knew existed. And although U.S. citizens may have a responsibility to serve their country, the government had no right to draft them. This caused people to start riots and strikes, move to Canada, and more so that they wouldn't have to be a part of an unjust war. Ultimately, the government's mistakes led to the death of many innocent young Americans and even more Vietnamese people.